Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The pro-Brexit businessman Aaron Banks has again insisted that all the money he provided for a campaign to leave the EU was generated from his businesses in the UK and therefore within the rules on political donations. The multi-million-pound donation is being investigated by the National Crime Agency. In a BBC interview this morning, Mr Banks said the money came from a UK company called Rock Services, which he said had all sorts of revenues. One MP has accused him of bluster and contradictory and confusing statements. Manveen Rana reports.
Aaron Banks, Brexiteer, businessman, and now the subject of a criminal investigation into the source of the funds he provided to the Brexit campaign. As he arrived at the BBC this morning to speak to the Andrew Marr programme, he faced serious questions about where the £8 million had come from.
I'd just like to say, absolutely, for the record, there was no Russian money and no interference of any type.
All right, well, let's follow the money, as it were.
I just want to be absolutely clear about that.
The Electoral Commission say they suspect Aaron Banks was not the true source of the £8 million he loaned to Brexit campaign groups. Mr Banks claims the money came from his UK-based company Rock Services. However, the Electoral Commission suspects the money came from the parent company Rock Holdings, registered in the Isle of Man, which would make it an illegal source of funds under UK electoral law.
I'm just making clear where
the money trail was at the heart of the interview with Andrew Marr.
Where did the money originally come from?
It came from a UK company
Which
that had
company?
cash generated in the UK.
Which UK company?
Rock Services. We've evidenced that to the Electoral Commission.
Rock Services is a shell company. It doesn't generate
You
money
just said
itself.
it's a shell company.
We don't see how Rock Services can generate £8 million quid.
Are we not at the position where the Electoral Commission have referred it? We will explain ourselves and the accounting that went behind it, and I'm very happy with it.
You told Parliament that Rock Services was just a service company. You've told me something very different today.
I haven't seen the actual transcript of that. I will go back and look at that. But I'm telling you that the source of the funding was Rock Services.
The Electoral Commission, who have seen the accounts of Rock Services, claim there were insufficient funds to justify such a large donation.
You're not giving me an answer, you're avoiding
I've said.
An MP from the Select Committee that quizzed Mr Banks says his explanations so far have been inconsistent and full of bluster.
It's clear from what Mr Banks said today that some of the lines that he is now presenting contradict what he told us on the Select Committee. It's a very confused picture that he is presenting. I think that's quite deliberate. I'm delighted that we are now going to have a forensic analysis and investigation of Mr Banks' affairs.
As the criminal investigation gets underway, Aaron Banks can now expect months of financial scrutiny by the authorities. Manveen Rana, BBC News.
Good afternoon. The man who funded Nigel Farage's Brexit campaign has told Sky News that none of the money came from Russia or any other foreign country. Aaron Banks donated some £8 million to the unofficial Leave campaign, leave.eu. Britain's democratic watchdog, the Electoral Commission, has asked the National Crime Agency to investigate because they say they have reason to suspect the money came from impermissible sources and its true source was knowingly concealed. Here's our political correspondent, Lewis Goodall.
This man, Aaron Banks, made the biggest political donation in British history, £8 million to the unofficial pro-Brexit campaign, Leave.eu. That donation is now the subject of a police investigation, having been referred by the Electoral Commission, who do not believe the money came from where Mr Banks said it did. This morning, Banks took to the airwaves to defend himself.
As far as I'm concerned, we've released the bank statements for Rock Holdings, which was a holding company that doesn't trade, and it's absolutely clear that no foreign money came into it. It's just allegation after allegation. It is a bit of a witch hunt.
This all comes down to the insurance tycoon's opaque finances. He claims the £8 million came from one of his companies, the Bristol-based Rock Services. The Electoral Commission don't believe that. They say that it didn't have the money to do so. They think it comes from Rock Holdings, a company based in the Isle of Man. If that's the case, it would constitute an impermissible, illegal donation, as foreign donations are not allowed under British electoral law. Some have also said that Banks simply didn't have the money, and it came from somewhere else. Given Banks' Russian connections, his meetings with Russian diplomats, his Russian wife, some whisper darkly that the money might even have come from the Kremlin, something Mr Banks resolutely denies.
I'd be absolutely clear that I have no connection with any Russian businesses. I've done no deals in Russia, and I've had lunch with the Russian ambassador a couple of times.
Russian involvement or not, Banks has changed his story. He told Parliament in June that Rock Services was a treasury company with no money of its own. The company he now claims was his donation source.
Rock Services, as we just discussed, is a treasury function that just delivers, the cash. It's just a service company, and the actual loan came from another one of my companies that was delivered in.
I just want people to be open.
One of the MPs on that committee remains unimpressed.
Not only did he not adequately explain it, but he also appeared to contradict some of the evidence that he gave to our select committee back in June about this particular company that he mentioned. So we really need a proper examination of Mr. Banks' finances, and I hope through the National Crime Agency that's what we're going to get.
This question goes beyond Mr. Banks alone. Unless Russian involvement can be proven in all of this, then the referendum result is highly unlikely to be overturned. This saga, though, does expose something about the weakness of our election law when it comes to referenda. Unlike in an election where if an individual MP breaks the rules, then their result could be overturned. Everyone knows that won't happen with a once-in-a-lifetime referendum result. The incentive to cheat, therefore, is so great. The disincentives, even with police involvement potentially so small, that it's easy to see how this sort of thing might happen. Banks repeatedly failed to clear up where the money came from today. The questions then won't go away. The 2016 referendum result seems destined to be forever contested, politically, culturally, and now even legally. Lewis Goodall, Sky News, Westminster.
OK, well, Lewis joins us now from Westminster. Lewis, a lot of allegations flying around today. Where does this all leave us?
Well, Kimberly, as I was saying there, I don't think the questions are clearly going to go away. Indeed, a very close associate of Mr. Banks, Andy Wigmore, has said that he will continue to release information, financial information, bank records, bank receipts, bank statements, and so on and so forth into the public realm and to media organisations. Also, we've got coming in before the Culture Select Committee later this week, we've got someone from the Electoral Commission, the Information Commissioner. Doubtless they will be questioned about all of this. But if we just take a step back for a moment and just try and leave aside the particulars of Mr. Banks, clearly what is going to continue to happen is that the 2016 referendum result, already in many people's minds, because it was so close and because it was so contentious and because some people think that we haven't got, as a result of the negotiations, what we were promised, will continue to go down and be further delegitimised in the minds of some people. Likewise, some people will see and agree with Mr. Banks everything that he said, that this is just a witch hunt. It is worth noting, however, as well, there's been a lot of criticism towards the media for even interviewing Mr. Banks. But the fact of the matter is that even though he's under police investigation, he has not been charged, and that's why the media, including ourselves on Sky News, have chosen to interview him. This will continue to be a running sore. For Remainers, they really want to try and speed this whole process up. They want the NCA to report quickly before March the 29th, because if they do, they think that it will be there will be another weapon in their armoury to further call for a so-called people's vote. Seems unlikely to happen to me, but you never know.
OK, Lewis, thank you so much. OK, well, I'm joined now by the journalist Carol Cadwallader, who makes new charges against Arron Banks on the front page of today's Observer over links between the pro-Brexit campaign and his insurance business, which he also denies. Carol, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Arron Banks, he's appeared on our channel and others today. He robustly denies that any money for Leave.eu came from impermissible sources. What do you think about what he said?
Well, it was very interesting to see him on camera there talking about, once again, misleading the public about his contacts with the Russian government. So there he said that he'd had a couple of lunches with the Russian ambassador. Now, we now know it is multiple meetings with the Russian ambassador. In the same week some of these happened, that Leave EU launched its official campaign. So on the actual day that Leave EU held its press launch, and this is the campaign which Nigel Farage fronted, it was that all of the money went to support Nigel Farage's Leave campaign. On that very day, Arron Banks was invited into the Russian embassy, where the Russian ambassador introduced him to an oligarch who offered him these lucrative gold and diamond deals. And we know that meetings went on for many months afterwards, and we know that Arron Banks declared publicly that he was investing in gold. Now, why this matters is because Russia, we know, has supported political parties from both the left and the right all across Europe. This is a strategy that it does. And it's not usually a case of Russia just writing a cheque and giving it to a political campaign. It's usually more about enriching a businessman, providing a sweetheart deal. And these are the really profound and important questions that that Arron Banks has yet to answer, and that, as far as we know, there is no actual official investigation yet into. So I'm really glad that you were at least able to ask that question of him today.
Let's talk about the story on the front of today's Observer that claims that he misled Parliament over links between Leave.eu and his insurance business during the EU referendum campaign. When he spoke to us, Mr. Banks said it was declared to the Electoral Commission that we seconded a small number of people to run a call centre in Bristol. The expenditure was expended to the Electoral Commission. Basically, he said that it was disclosed to the Commission, they accepted it and they moved on.
So this is something completely different. This is a whole set of new revelations that we published in the Observer today, and another publication, Open Democracy, separately published today. And it raises really significant new questions, because Arron Banks is not just under investigation by the National Crime Agency. That was the new investigation which was initiated this week. He's also being investigated by the Met Police for overspending, and also by the Information Commissioner for use of data. They're specifically looking at, did he use insurance data for political purposes? So now this is now a further allegations which are being made that he overspent during the referendum period, which is a criminal offence, and that there was potentially illegal coordination between the campaigns. And so this is and he specifically was asked about these allegations in Parliament by MPs, and he said that it was a flat lie. Now, the Observer has spoken to eyewitnesses from inside the call centre, and we've seen vast troves of documentary evidence that completely refutes this. And so it really requires further scrutiny, and we are going to be handing over this evidence now to the committee which is looking at this.
Sorry to jump in there, but he specifically said that it was declared to the Electoral Commission that they had a small number of people seconded to run a call centre in Bristol.
Yes.
The expenditure was expended to the Electoral Commission. They accepted it and moved on.
And some of it was properly declared. That is correct. However, this is new allegations from employees who told me that how uncomfortable they were. They were there. They'd been employed to do insurance business inside Banks's Bristol headquarters, and they were being forced to make propaganda using sort of these ugly images of immigrants and refugees, and many of them objected to it, but they were told they had no choice, and we can see this in email after email.
OK, Carol, let's pick up on that point, the emails, because in our interview with him today, Mr. Banks made specific claims about you. He said that you blackmailed and harassed a young researcher in Isabel Oakeshott's book area to actually steal the emails. And he also said that his entire email base was hacked and stolen at the behest of 2 journalists, including yourself, and that the person in question has made a statement to the police, and that statement will be released tomorrow. How do you respond to his claims?
I have been investigating Arron Banks and the finances of the Leave campaign, their use of data, for almost 2 years now. And Banks has gone to extraordinary efforts to discredit my investigation and to smear the Observer's and Guardian's journalism. Now, these are really serious allegations that he has made, and there is absolutely not one iota of truth in them. And it is a classic tactic that he uses, that instead of answering questions about the vast amount of money that he put into the campaigns, that there are now 4 serious investigations over, he tries to turn it upon the journalists who are just doing their jobs. That's all I'm trying to do, is do my job.
I think that perhaps if you asked him about what he said earlier to us, he would refer back to things like, you asked me where it came from. My business was valued in November 2017 at 250 million by a top-tier accounting firm. We have 500,000 customers in the UK, and we have 2% of the UK's motor firm. He said the money came from a UK company, cash was generated in the UK, and the allegation that it came from the Isle of Man, and he said that statements will be made available on Monday.
So, Aaron, this investigation by the Electoral Commission was opened 1 year ago. For a whole year, the Electoral Commission has been investigating the source of those finances. At any point during that year, Aaron Banks could have been transparent and open and put this on the record. Instead, what he did, he faced MPs in Parliament and he refused to answer their questions. He actually walked out of the hearing. This is somebody who wanted to take back control for Britain, to give control to Britain's Parliament, showing absolute contempt to our lawmakers. So it is plainly ridiculous that now it has actually been referred to the National Crime Agency and as a matter of serious criminal investigation that Banks is turning around and claiming complete transparency when he has done every single thing he can to avoid that.
OK, Carol Cadwallader, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thanks for having me.
The controversial Brexit campaigner at the centre of a criminal investigation into whether he broke election law insisted today he hadn't and said the millions he gave to the unofficial Vote Leave campaign were above board. Aaron Banks told ITV News the cash came from his UK insurance business and not from the Isle of Man. Our political correspondent Emily Morgan has more.
It didn't take long for Aaron Banks to return from Bermuda and head to the television studios. The co-founder of Leave.eu had something to get off his chest. He hasn't done anything illegal, he says. The £8 million donated to the campaign group was all his.
Could you tell ITV News where that money came from?
I told you it came from me and my company. I can't really say more than that. We've released our bank statements for Rock Holdings, which is the allegation. It shows that no money's gone into Rock Holdings from Russians or anyone else. It's a holding company. We've been fully open and transparent.
Mr. Banks is facing a criminal investigation over donations made during the Brexit referendum. The elections watchdog referred him to the National Crime Agency because it alleges he was not the true source of the cash. It claims the money was loaned illegally because it came from Rock Holdings Limited, a company based in the Isle of Man, which under election law isn't allowed. But Mr. Banks says it was in fact money generated in the UK from an insurance company he runs and therefore didn't break any rules. He denied Rock Services has no funds to give away.
How was the money generated by Rock Services?
We employ nearly 1,000 people. We've got over 500,000 customers. That's the size of Manchester, and we generate revenues and premium of over £250 million a year.
In the UK?
In the UK.
Many people don't believe you.
I don't care. Many people voted Remain. Many people. I mean, as I said, it's the haters are going to hate, the lovers are going to love.
He might quote Taylor Swift lyrics to emphasise the divisions over Brexit and accuse the Electoral Commission of political motivation. But the point is the National Crime Agency is now investigating, and it won't be long before we know the true version of events. Emily Morgan, ITV News in Westminster.
Now, the businessman Aaron Banks is under renewed pressure to explain the source of the millions of pounds used to fund the pro-Brexit Leave.eu campaign. The National Crime Agency launched its investigation after allegations that Mr. Banks might not be the real source of the cash. Mr. Banks, who's denied any wrongdoing, insisted there was no Russian money and no interference of any kind, declaring the money came from a UK-based limited company which he owned. Here's Fatima Manji.
The Brexit bankroller Aaron Banks arrived to give his first interview since the announcement he's facing a criminal investigation. It centres around £8 million he gave to Leave supporting groups. The Electoral Commission suspects that the money didn't come from Banks himself and that he deliberately hid the true source.
The money came from a UK registered company. It was generated from cash, generated from businesses in the UK. For the record, there was no Russian money and no interference of any type.
What was the company that generated £8 million?
I've answered it. Rock Services.
But Rock Services is not a trading company.
Well, we're going to have to agree to differ on that. I think I know my business affairs better than you.
Contrast that to what he told MPs in June.
Rock Services, as we just discussed, is a treasury function that just delivers, the cash. It's just a service company. and the actual loan came from another one of my companies that was delivered in.
You've got to have a picture with Nigel.
On his way out of the BBC Today, Aaron Banks was amused by 3 anti-Brexit protesters and a Nigel Farage puppet. But here's what happened when we tried to get some answers.
Will you make your accounts available to Channel 4 News?
I won't make anything available to Channel 4 News.
Well, if you've got nothing to hide, what's the problem?
Channel 4 News is the leading proponent of fake news and Remainer, angst in the country.
But you've been very clear. You've got nothing to hide. So why don't you share your account?
I've given my interview to Mark.
And the BBC, and we will publish everything that we gave to the BBC later on today.
So share it with us.
And we will.
You'll be making it public.
Anyone who wants to look at it can.
And will you be willing to come on Channel 4 News to answer some questions on that basis?
Look, I'd rather go and put a revolver against my temple and pull the trigger than go on Channel 4 News, if that's okay with you.
This programme previously investigated several diamond mines in southern Africa, which Mr Banks claimed were one source of his wealth. Channel 4 News found several of them shuttered and evidence the mines had been losing money and struggled to pay wages. In court documents, his former business partner in the mines claimed Mr Banks had tried to plug the financial hole with Russian cash, but the funds, he alleged, were diverted to pay for Brexit. Aaron Banks has always denied such allegations. Today, the Sunday Times says Mr Banks is now also facing an inquiry from the Financial Conduct Authority, which regulates the insurance industry.
Mr Banks, this investigation by the Financial Conduct Authority, are you worried about it at all?
Not by Channel 4.
Why don't you talk to us? I mean, if you've got nothing to hide, why don't you have a chat?
You really want to get Michael Crick out. He's the expert at doorstepping.
Michael Crick's not here.
I knew that. So,
Will you
good luck.
talk to me?
I'm not going to talk to the second best. There we go.
Well, listen, Mr Banks. You are now being accused. You are now being accused of misleading MPs.
Thank you.
Do you have anything to say about that at all?
No.
Why are you so scared?
Just given an interview to Bar. Just given an interview to Sky.
Why are you so scared?
Because Channel 4 are a propaganda channel. They're not a news channel.
We will let our viewers make their minds up.
I think your viewers know what you are.
They certainly do,
yes.
And they would like to hear from you.
Yeah, they've heard from me. I've done interview after interview.
They would like us
Let
to
me
question
make it clear. I'm not interested in Channel 4. I'm not interested in you. And I'm now going to lunch. Thank you.
And with that, he was off. Perhaps the National Crime Agency will be able to get more answers about where Aaron Banks actually gets his money from.
The determined Fatima Manji reporting there. Well, earlier I spoke to the MP Ian Lucas, who's on the Digital, Culture, Media and Sports Committee, and I asked him whether he was any the wiser as to where the pro-Brexit campaign money actually came from.
I'm none the wiser. In fact, I'm more confused. So to get to the bottom of this, we really need a forensic analysis of the paperwork, the paper trail, the bank accounts, which hopefully the National Crime Agency is now going to provide.
And without getting too deep into the weeds of all this, where was there a contradiction? Just explain that to us.
Well, he talked about 2 different companies, Rock Services and another rock-related company. So this was not a surprise.
He did say very clearly right at the beginning of the interview that there was no Russian money, there was no foreign money involved in this whatsoever. It was all his money and it all came from the UK, where he is a taxpayer.
He does say things clearly, but they're often contradictory and they're certainly not backed up by written evidence. And that's what we've never seen from Mr. Banks. And this is hugely important. This is the biggest donation in political history, which obviously had a profound impact on the debate that was happening at the time. And it's all about whether he played by the rules.
But why has it taken so long for this incredibly important donation to be investigated properly?
That's really a matter for the National Crime Agency, and I guess ultimately a matter for the government. It is incredibly complex. We've spent a long time, over a year now, on the Select Committee investigating this. We don't have powers to demand documents. I'm very pleased now that the National Crime Agency has announced this inquiry. It may be in the next few days we hear that further inquiries could be initiated by other public bodies like the Information Commission.
Do you believe reports in the media that Theresa May sat on an investigation into where this money came from because it suited her politically to do so?
That's a very grave allegation to make against a prime minister. And I'd be very, very concerned if there's any evidence of that. But I think it's very important that Theresa May comes out and makes clear to us that she did not do that. We questioned the Secretary of State about this less than 2 weeks ago, and he made clear that the investigating authorities and the police needed to follow the evidence, which is what they should be doing.
When Mr. Banks appeared in front of your committee back in June, he treated you personally, but also many members of your committee, with quite a lot of disrespect. Essentially, he said he's got a lunch appointment, he doesn't want to be late, he's already given you 20 minutes of his time, he didn't want to give you any more. I mean, frankly, he was thumbing his nose at you. He wasn't taking you seriously, and there wasn't an awful lot you could do about it.
Well, I think we did do something about it. We obtained evidence from him, which he is now contradicting when he's giving interviews today. We've accumulated evidence, we've doggedly pursued the case, and we produced a report which is stood up. We're going to produce another report later in the year. We've been working very closely with the Information Commissioner and the Electoral Commission to get to the truth of this matter, and I think we're getting there.
Ian Lucas, thank you very much.